Imagine you are the most feared soldier on the face of the earth. Not in theory, not on paper. In actual, bloody, bone-crushing reality. Armies have crumbled at the sight of you. Kings have paid fortunes just to have you fight on their side. For decades, maybe centuries, your reputation alone has changed the outcome of wars before a single sword was even drawn. You are the Swiss Pikeman, and right now, on a cold April morning, in 1522, you are standing at the edge of a sunken road outside a little village in northern Italy called Bicocca, staring at a wall of earth and timber packed with men holding guns, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a terrible thought is forming. A thought that has never visited a Swiss soldier before. The thought that says, "We're going to lose." That is where we are starting today. Because what happened at Bicocca on April 27, 1522, is not just a battle, it is a turning point. A before and after, a moment where the medieval world looked the modern world dead in the eyes and blinked. And if you want to understand how warfare transformed, how power shifted, how the very idea of what makes a soldier dangerous changed forever, then you need to know this story. So stay with me, because we are going to go all the way back to the beginning. Build this thing up piece by piece, and by the time we get to that sunken road, you are going to feel exactly what those Swiss soldiers felt, and it is not going to be comfortable. Let's start with the Swiss themselves, because you cannot understand Bicocca without understanding just how extraordinary these men were. We are talking about soldiers from the mountain cantons of Switzerland, men who grew up in a landscape that made them tough by default. The Alps are not kind, they do not forgive weakness, and the communities that developed there, fiercely independent, deeply communal, militarily organized at the most local level you can imagine, they produced warriors of a very specific kind, warriors who fought together, warriors who drilled together, trained together, and were willing to die together in a way that professional armies of the era simply could not match. Their weapon was the pike, a long, sometimes 18-foot-long pole with a steel head at the end. On its own, not that impressive, but put 500 men together with pikes, all moving in tight formation, all stepping in rhythm, all pushing forward like a human battering ram, and you have something that was genuinely terrifying to face. The Swiss called this formation the Gewalthaufen, the mass of force, and that is exactly what it was, a dense, bristling square of men that could absorb punishment and then accelerate into the enemy with shocking speed. The Swiss did not advance slowly. They ran, they screamed, they hit enemy lines like a wave hitting a cliff, and the result was usually catastrophic for whoever was standing in the way. And here is the thing that made them truly special. They did not just fight for money the way other mercenaries did. Well, they did fight for money. The Swiss mercenary system was highly organized and profitable, but they also had this incredible internal discipline and unit cohesion that money alone could not buy. They had a culture of military pride that was almost religious in its intensity. To be a Swiss pikeman was to be part of something that went beyond any individual battle. Defeats were shameful, not just strategically, but personally, morally, existentially. These men had an identity built around being unbeatable. And for a long time, that identity was completely justified. Look at what they did at Grandson. In 1476, the Burgundians under Charles the Bold, one of the richest and most powerful rulers in Europe at the time, had an army that was considered essentially invincible, professional, well-equipped, experienced. The Swiss hit them so hard and so fast that it became a rout almost immediately. Then at Murten, a few months later, they did it again, and at Nancy in 1477, Charles the Bold himself was killed, his body found in a ditch, half eaten by wolves. The Swiss had destroyed not just an army but a duchy. They had ended a major European power in less than 2 years of fighting. After that, everybody wanted them. The French, the papacy, the Italian city-states, the Holy Roman Empire, they all competed to hire Swiss soldiers because these men were simply the best infantry in the world. Full stop. No argument. If you had Swiss pike squares on your side, you had a massive advantage. If you were facing Swiss pike squares, you had a massive problem. This lasted for decades, right through the end of the 15th century, right into the 16th. The Swiss were the defining military force of their era. But history does not stand still. And while the Swiss were perfecting the art of the pike square, something else was happening in European warfare. Something quiet at first, almost easy to dismiss. Gunpowder weapons were getting better. Now I want to be careful here because there is a temptation to tell this story as though guns simply appeared one day and made everything else obsolete overnight. That is not how it worked. Firearms had been around in various primitive forms since the 13th and 14th centuries, and for a long time they were genuinely more trouble than they were worth. Early guns were slow to load, wildly inaccurate, prone to misfiring, and required so much specialized knowledge and preparation that they were often more dangerous to their operators than to the enemy. An armored knight on a warhorse was not particularly afraid of early firearms because, realistically, the odds of a bullet actually hitting him and penetrating his armor were fairly low. But here is where technology does what technology always does. It improves, slowly, incrementally, with a lot of dead ends and failed experiments along the way, but relentlessly. By the early 16th century, the arquebus, a shoulder-fired matchlock musket, had become a genuinely effective battlefield weapon in the right circumstances. It still had problems. Loading was slow. Wet weather could ruin your powder. The effective range was limited. But in the right tactical situation, with the right support and protection, a group of arquebusiers could lay down a volume of fire that was devastating, especially against tightly packed infantry formations. You know, formations like Swiss pike squares. And here is the other piece of the puzzle that is absolutely essential to understanding Bicocca. Artillery. By the early 16th century, field artillery had improved dramatically. The French in particular had developed fast, mobile bronze cannon that could be moved with an army and deployed on the battlefield in ways that simply had not been possible a generation earlier. This mattered enormously. A cannonball fired into a densely packed formation of men is not just killing one person. It is a physical wave of destruction that can punch through multiple bodies, knock men off their feet, tear through the psychological cohesion that makes a pike XQ work. And unlike an arquebus, a cannon cannot be stopped by running faster. You cannot charge through artillery fire the way you can charge through sword or spear. So you have these two developments happening simultaneously, improvements in personal firearms and improvements in artillery, and they are both pointing in the same direction, toward a world where being packed closely together is increasingly dangerous rather than increasingly powerful. The Swiss model, which depended on density and momentum and shock, was going to run into a wall eventually. And that wall turned out to be, almost literally, at Bicocca. Now let's set the stage for 1522, because the political situation is as complicated as 16th century Italian politics always was, which is to say spectacularly complicated. We are in the middle of what historians call the Italian Wars, a series of conflicts that ran from 1494 all the way to 1559, and essentially turned the Italian peninsula into the battlefield where the great powers of Europe fought out their rivalry. On one side you have the French crown, which has been trying to establish dominance in northern Italy since Charles VIII invaded in 1494. On the other side you have the Habsburgs, specifically the Spanish branch under the new King Charles I, who in 1519 also became Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, making him arguably the most powerful monarch in Europe at that particular moment. In between, and constantly trying to navigate the impossible currents of this great power rivalry, are the Italian states themselves. Milan, Venice, Florence, the papacy, all maneuvering desperately to avoid being swallowed by one great power or the other, all willing to switch sides with remarkable speed whenever it seemed like the math had changed in their favor. In 1521, the French were in control of the Duchy of Milan. Francis I of France was the French key. Njeg, a young, ambitious, energetic ruler who fancied himself a Renaissance prince in the grandest tradition. And as part of his Italian strategy, he had a substantial force in northern Italy, including, crucially, a significant contingent of Swiss mercenaries. Because of course he did. You were nobody in Italian warfare without Swiss pikemen if you could afford them. But by early 1522, things had gone badly for the French in northern Italy. Imperial and papal forces had pushed them back from Milan. The French commander, Odet de Foix, Viscount of Lautrec, a capable but not brilliant general, found himself in a deteriorating situation. His army needed to act, to push back against the Imperial Spanish forces and reassert French control. But there was a problem, a serious problem. The Swiss in his army were getting restless. You see, Swiss mercenaries had a contract, and part of that contract involved being paid regularly, on time, in actual money. And the French crown, which was perpetually short of funds because running a 16th century great power was extraordinarily expensive, had fallen behind on payments. The Swiss soldiers were owed months of back pay, and they were not happy about it. In fact, they were threatening to simply go home, to pick up their pikes and march back over the Alps and leave Lautrec to fight his war without them. This put Lautrec in an agonizing position. He needed to do something militarily, but the timing was terrible. His army was not in the best condition. The Imperial Spanish forces under Prospero Colonna, an experienced Italian condottiere, commander in the service of the Emperor, had taken up a defensive position at the Park of Bicocca, just north of Milan, and Colonna had done something smart, something that Lautrec should have taken very seriously as a warning sign. Colonna had used his time to fortify. He had taken the natural feature of a sunken road, a lane that ran through the park, and sat below the level of the surrounding terrain, creating a kind of natural trench, and he had enhanced it. His men had dug earthworks, built ramparts, positioned artillery. The Imperial Spanish position at Bicocca was not just a field army waiting to fight in the open. It was a fortified defensive line, with guns carefully placed to cover the approaches, with arquebusiers positioned behind earthen walls, with the sunken road itself acting as a killing ground for anyone who tried to cross it. Specifically, Colonna placed his Spanish arquebusiers, some of the best in Europe at this point, behind the earthwork ramparts where they had cover and a clear field of fire. He positioned his artillery to sweep the approaches, and he kept his own Pikemen, his Landskornets, German mercenary Pikemen, in reserve behind the defensive line, ready to counterattack if anyone actually managed to breach the position. It was a textbook defensive setup for the era, taking maximum advantage of the terrain and the technology available. Lautrec could see this, his experienced officers could see it, and the general consensus among the French leadership, when they looked at that position, was that a frontal assault was not the right move. The smart play, most of them argued, was to maneuver, to go around, to use the French army's mobility to find a better angle, or to force Colonna out of his defensive position by threatening his supply lines, or simply to wait and let hunger and logistics do what military force could not safely attempt. This was actually sound strategic thinking. Colonna's position was strong, but a besieging or maneuvering force has options that a static defensive force does not. If Lautrec could threaten Milan itself, or cut off Imperial supply routes, Colonna might have to abandon his prepared position and fight in the open, which would be a completely different tactical situation. But then the Swiss weighed in, the Swiss captains representing their soldiers who were owed months of back pay and had absolutely no interest in another week of maneuvering and waiting, delivered something close to an ultimatum: fight now. Give us a battle where we can prove our worth and take some loot and justify our continued presence, or we are leaving. We are done. We are going home. And here is the tragic heart of what happened at Bicocca. Lautrec, politically unable to let his Swiss contingent simply walk away, strategically committed to the Italian campaign, financially unable to pay them what would have convinced them to wait, was essentially forced into making a decision he knew was wrong. He authorized the attack. He let the Swiss have their battle, and everybody who understood the tactical situation knew it was going to be a disaster. The attack was set for the morning of April 27, 1522. The French plan, such as it was, involved a two-pronged assault. The Swiss would attack from one direction, advancing across open ground toward the sunken road and the earthworks beyond it. French cavalry and other infantry would operate on the flanks and potentially exploit any breach the Swiss could create. Artillery would try to suppress the Imperial guns before the assault went in. Now let's stop here and think about this for just a moment, because I want you to really appreciate the geography and what it meant for what was about to happen. The Swiss were going to advance across open, flat ground in their tight pike formations toward a sunken road that was essentially a natural trench. On the other side of that road, sitting on higher ground behind earthen ramparts, were experienced Spanish arquebusiers with loaded guns and a clear field of fire. The Swiss would have to cross the open ground and, under fire, then somehow get down into the sunken road and then climb out of it on the other side, all while men with guns were shooting at them from basically point-blank range. And then, if they somehow managed all of that, they would have to fight their way through the earthworks, while artillery tried to tear them apart. There was no version of this attack that should have worked, not with the technology of 1522, not against those defenses, not against those arquebusiers. The math was brutally simple and entirely unfavorable to the men with the long sticks, but the Swiss did not see it that way. Or rather, some of them saw it perfectly clearly and decided it did not matter because retreating was worse than dying. Their identity, their entire reason for being, was bound up in the willingness to advance under any circumstances, to hesitate, to pull back, to say this fight is not winnable and we should look for another way. That was not something the Swiss pike culture could accommodate. Their reputation was built on ferocity and forward momentum. You did not maintain a reputation like that by being sensible at Bicocca. So on the morning of April 27th, the Swiss formed their squares and they advanced, and it started badly and got worse. The French artillery, which was supposed to suppress the Imperial guns, failed to do its job effectively, whether because of poor positioning or because Colonna's earthworks provided better protection than expected, or simply because the Imperial gunners were well trained and held their nerve. The preparatory bombardment did not silence the defensive artillery. So when the Swiss started moving across the open ground, they were moving into active cannon fire. And cannon fire into a dense pike square is not like anything else on a battlefield. It does not just kill men. It does not just wound them. It tears holes in the formatio, and it creates chaos in the ranks. It breaks the psychological coherence that makes the whole system work. But the Swiss kept coming, because that is what Swiss pikemen did. They reached the edge of the sunken road, and then it became a different kind of disaster. The sunken road was deeper than it looked from a distance. Getting down into it under fire was difficult. Getting back out the other side, climbing up a bank, while Spanish arquebusiers were firing into you from a few meters away, was nearly impossible, and the arquebusiers were not running out of ammunition. They were in a covered position. They could reload relatively safely. They could keep firing as long as men kept trying to climb out of that road. And men kept trying to climb out of that road. The Swiss lost some of their best commanders in those first awful minutes. Giovanni de' Medici, commanding Italian forces on the French side, was wounded early and taken out of action. More importantly for the Swiss, several of their own captains were killed in the assault. Men whose names were known throughout the cantons, men who represented the kind of leadership that Swiss pike formations depended on at the local level. The carnage was extraordinary, even by the standards of an era that was not squeamish about battlefield casualties. The combination of artillery fire on the approach, arquebuses fire at the road itself, and the physical impossibility of effectively scaling the far bank under fire created a killing ground of exceptional efficiency. Colonna had essentially built an early version of what later military thinkers would call a killing zone, a place where the physical terrain and the positioning of firepower combined to make survival nearly impossible for anyone who entered it. What makes Bicocca so historically significant, beyond just the death toll, is the question of what the Swiss did next. Oh, rather, what they tried to do next. Because despite taking catastrophic casualties, despite losing captains, despite the obvious futility of continuing to throw men into that sunken road, the Swiss kept attacking, wave after wave, formation after formation. They did not break and run, which given the circumstances would have been entirely understandable. They kept going forward, which was both the most admirable thing you could say about them and the most tragic. Eventually they had to stop. Not because they lost their nerve, but because there were not enough of them left to maintain the formations. The assault had cost the Swiss somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men dead, depending on which source you trust, in a single morning, in a battle that lasted perhaps an hour or two at most. Those were not just soldiers, those were experienced pikemen, the veterans who passed their knowledge to younger men, the backbone of the Swiss military system, and a significant chunk of them were dead in and around that sunken road outside a little park in northern Italy. Lautrec had to withdraw what remained of the army. The campaign was effectively over. Within days, the Swiss survivors, their grievances about pay still unresolved, their pride shattered in a way that would have been unimaginable even a week before, marched back over the Alps. Lautrec retreated toward France. Milan remained in Imperial hands, and Bicocca entered the history books. Now I want to spend some time on why this battle mattered so much, because the immediate outcome, a French defeat in a campaign in northern Italy, is actually the least interesting part of the story. What matters is what Bicocca revealed about where warfare was going, and what it said about the end of the Swiss moment. The first thing it revealed was the power of properly organized defensive firepower. Colonna had done anything technologically revolutionary at Bicocca. He had not deployed weapons that did not exist elsewhere. What he had done was figure out how to use the weapons he had, combined with terrain and repaired defenses, to nullify the greatest offensive military force of his era. This was a preview of something that would define the next few centuries of European warfare, the increasing importance of defensive preparation, of field fortification, of choosing ground and organizing firepower rather than simply having the hardest hitting troops and letting them fight. The second thing Bicocca revealed was the specific vulnerability of the pike square to coordinated firearms. The very thing that made the Swiss so powerful, their density, their closeness, their physical cohesion as a formation, made them exceptionally vulnerable to guns. Firearms do not care about discipline. They do not care about courage. A ball fired from an arquebus does not respect the reputation of the man it hits. And a ball fired into a tightly packed group of men is almost certain to hit someone. The Swiss could not use their advantages at Bicocca because their advantages required them to close with the enemy, and closing with the enemy meant crossing ground under fire, and crossing ground under fire meant dying before you ever got close enough to use your pike. The third thing, and this might be the most important in the long run, is what Bicocca said about the relationship between military reputation and military reality. The Swiss had built their power, their income, their entire place in European affairs on the reputation of being unbeatable. That reputation had been earned, genuinely earned, over decades of warfare, but it had also become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Enemies hesitated to fight the Swiss because they knew what happened when you fought the Swiss. The Swiss had psychological leverage that went far beyond their actual numbers. After Bicocca, that psychological leverage was damaged, not destroyed immediately, but cracked. The Swiss were still dangerous. They were still excellent soldiers. But now, everyone knew they could be beaten, and more importantly, they knew how they could be beaten. The impact on Swiss military culture was significant. In the decades following Bicocca, the Swiss gradually began adapting. They integrated more firearms into their own forces. They became more willing to operate in combined arms formations alongside arquebusiers and artillery rather than insisting on pure pike square tactics. The great Swiss pike squares continued to operate and continued to be formidable. But the era when Swiss pike squares alone could decide the outcome of European battles was ending. Bicocca was the clearest announcement of that ending. It is also worth looking at what Bicocca meant for the Spanish military system, because this is where the story reaches forward into the future of European warfare. The soldiers who did the killing at Bicocca, the arquebusiers behind those earthen ramparts, were Spanish, and Spain, under the genius of commanders like Gonzalo de Córdoba, who had been developing these tactics for a generation, was in the process of creating what would become the tercios. The tercio was a combined arms formation that mixed pikemen with arquebusiers and later musketeers in a coordinated tactical system. It learned from the Swiss that close formations of disciplined infantry were decisive, and it learned from Bicocca that firearms had to be integrated into those formations, that you could not simply choose between pikes and guns, but had to figure out how to use them together. The tercios would dominate European battlefields for over a century. After Bicocca, they were the heirs of everything that Battle Revere led, and in a very real sense, every military development that led to the modern infantry soldier. The idea of troops that combine firepower with the ability to hold ground and advance in formation can trace a line back through the lessons of battles like Bicocca. But let's not get so caught up in the future that we forget the human weight of what happened on April 27, 1522. Because behind all the tactical analysis and historical significance, there is a human story that deserves to be felt, not just understood. Those Swiss soldiers who died at Bicocca were not abstractions. They were real men from real places, from Uri and Schweiz and Unterwalden and Bern and Zurich, from the valleys and the mountain villages that had made them what they were. Some of them were veterans who had been fighting in Italian campaigns for years, men who had seen a dozen battles and survived them all. Some of them were younger men on their first campaign, drawn by the money and the adventure and the tradition that said Swiss soldiers were the best there were, and that being the best was worth something. All of them, when they formed their squares and started walking toward that sunken road, believed at some level that what they were was enough, that their training and their courage and the weight of their collective reputation could get them through what they were walking into. It could not, and the gap between what they believed and what was actually true on that particular morning on that particular ground is one of the saddest things in the history of warfare. Not because they lacked courage. They clearly did not lack courage, not because they were poorly led in some fundamental sense. Their commanders were as experienced as any in Europe, but because the world had changed in ways that their system of war had not yet fully accounted for, and they paid for that gap with their lives in enormous numbers. There is something almost Greek about it. The Swiss at Bicocca are like tragic heroes who are destroyed not by any weakness or flaw, but by the very excess of their strength. Their willingness to advance, which had made them invincible for so long, was precisely what sent them into that killing ground and kept them there when every rational calculation said pull back. Their identity, forged in decades of triumph, was the thing that made it impossible to respond sensibly to a situation that was genuinely novel. History is full of moments like this, moments when the thing that made you great becomes, in changed circumstances, the thing that destroys you. The cavalry charge that was decisive in one era becomes suicidal in another. The fortification that was impregnable before a new type of artillery becomes a death trap. The economic system that created prosperity becomes the source of catastrophic fragility. What makes Bicocca such a clear and vivid example of this pattern is the speed of it. Within a single morning, in a battle that lasted perhaps 2 hours, the verdict was delivered. Not gradually, not ambiguously. The new world announced itself to the old one with terrible clarity. And the question it leaves you with, the question that I think makes this story genuinely resonant, beyond just the military history, is what do you do when the thing you are best at is no longer enough? When the identity you have built, personally or collectively, runs into a reality that does not care about your reputation or your history or the decades of effort you put into becoming what you are. The Swiss had to answer that question after Bicocca, and the ones who survived, the cantons that continued to supply mercenaries into the decades that followed, they answered it by adapting, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of resistance from traditionalists who believed the old ways were still the right ways. But they adapted. The Swiss guards who protect the Pope to this day are a kind of living echo of that mercenary tradition, a tradition that had its greatest crisis at a little park north of Milan in 1522. The bright colors of their uniform, which look almost theatrical to modern eyes, connect back to that era when Swiss soldiers were the most sought-after fighters in Europe. It is a long thread running from the pike squares of the 15th century to the present day, and it runs right through the sunken road at Bicocca. One more thing worth noting before we close this out. The Italian wars of which Bicocca was a part did not end the relevance of infantry. They did not end the relevance of courage or discipline or tactical sophistication. What they ended was the dominance of any single approach to warfare. After Bicocca, after the lessons of the Italian wars were absorbed, European armies became increasingly combined arms forces, forces that integrated cavalry and infantry and artillery and firearms in coordinated tactical systems. No single element was dominant. Everything depended on everything else. A pike square without arquebusier support was vulnerable to firepower. Arquebusiers without pikemen to protect them from cavalry were vulnerable to being ridden down. Artillery without infantry support could be captured by enemy foot soldiers. Everything needed everything else, and the commander who understood how to combine and coordinate these elements was the commander who won. This is in a sense the real legacy of Bicocca, not the defeat of the Swiss, not the triumph of Imperial arms, not even the advancement of Spanish military techniques. Though all of these things matter, the real legacy is the demonstration, vivid and bloody and impossible to ignore, that the age of the silver bullet was over, that no single type of soldier, no matter how excellent, no matter how experienced, no matter how terrifying their reputation, was going to be decisive by themselves in the new era of warfare. The world was getting more complicated. War was getting more complicated, and the soldiers and commanders who thrived in the centuries after Bicocca were the ones who could manage that complexity rather than the ones who could most perfectly embody a single terrifying ideal. The Swiss pikeman was the most fearsome infantry soldier in the world. On April 26, 1522. On April 27th, the world found out that was no longer quite true, and nothing in European warfare was ever quite the same again. That, right there, is why Bicocca matters. That is why a battle most people have never heard of, fought in a park outside Milan 500 years ago, deserves to be remembered and understood, because it is one of those rare moments when you can actually watch history change. When you can point to a specific date, a specific place, and say here is where one world ended and another began. Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending that time with me. History is full of these moments, these pivot points, where everything shifts, and if you want to keep exploring them with me, hit subscribe and come along for the next one. We have got a lot more ground to cover. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.